Hello, I'm Poetic Heretic, and this is your October 2019 astrology forecast. I'll be going over what I consider to be the most important astrological events in the month of October for Scorpio Sun, Rising, and Moon. So, let us begin. Before we can understand properly what is happening with the astrology of October, we have to go back to the end of September, specifically September 28th, when we had the new moon in Libra at 2:27 p.m. Eastern Time in your 12th house, and it was opposite Chiron. So this was the beginning of the current lunar cycle when you should be watching this video. And the reason that is so significant is because with it happening at the very end of September and each lunar cycle lasting about 28 days, the energy of this new moon is stretching through almost all of October. And so it's to affect almost the entire month, specifically until the next new moon, which is on October 27th. So what energy is that? A new moon in the 12th house is a very sort of private, secretive one. It's a time of new beginnings in the area of aloneness and solitude, if that makes sense. It's a time where you want to get off by yourself more and be alone more often, seek more solitude, and perhaps reflect upon things. That's what the 12th house is all about, is aloneness, solitude. So it's a much more peaceful, almost subtle new moon, as opposed to the next one, which is in your first house, which is much more intense, which we'll get to later. So that energy of 12th house matters. Beginning September 28th, 12th house matters, being aloneness and solitude and sometimes dreams, sometimes service to other people, stretches through almost all of October, as I mentioned. Now, the interesting thing about this new moon, and this next part applies to everyone, by the way, is that it was opposite Chiron, wounded healer Chiron. And so this new moon and this current lunar cycle is also going to be connected in some way with this idea of the healing of wounds, whether in someone else or yourself or a mixture of both, or even the healing of wounds in other people to heal the same kind of wounds in yourself, if that makes sense. It's kind of Chiron oversimplified. But that's what we have, this idea of the emphasis on the healing of wounds for this current lunar cycle. Going into October itself now, on October 3rd, we have Mercury exiting Libra and entering Scorpio. And that is at 4:14 a.m. Eastern Time. So that has Mercury going from your 12th to your first house. So the first basically 2 days of October, Mercury is finishing up its transit through your 12th house. So this really isn't anything new to you right here, but it's essentially this idea of Mercury in your 12th, which is a time of your mind being focused upon reflection and the past and more private matters and perhaps dreams. That time wrapping itself up, that time coming to a conclusion. And then in those early hours of October 3rd, once Mercury enters your first house, now all of a sudden, the things that you weren't really wanting to say, weren't really wanting to speak up and directly say while Mercury was in your 12th house, now you're ready to say. In other words, those first 2 days of October, you're still in this state where maybe you're not wanting to communicate certain things directly because your mind is much more internalized. But now from October 3rd onward, those same things you are feeling much more ready to say and be very assertive and direct about when it comes to communication. It could also have you being much more mentally active in general. You're sort of taking on the energy of Mercury in a very personal way, since the first house is the house of self. So as Mercury transits your first house, it's like you become personally very much like Mercury, very communicative, very mental, very intellectual. So you have that from October 3rd onward. On October 4th at 12:21 a.m., Mars exits Virgo and enters Libra, going from your 11th to your 12th house. So first 3 days of October, Mars finishes up its transit in your 11th house. So the time that you've been experiencing for a number of weeks now, where it's all about your goals being achieved through working with other people, through the group, through the community, through friends, that sort of thing. And also wanting to be a leader of that group. That is all coming to a close in the first 3 days. And then on October 4th, once Mars enters your 12th house, now instead of wanting to be in the group and community or whatnot, it's much more about being alone. It's a time to sort of get off by yourself and reflect upon your goals, reflect upon what you want to accomplish. Mars is what we prioritize. And so when it's transiting your 12th house, you're likely to find that you're prioritizing being alone much more. You're prioritizing solitude much more. And also with the 12th house's association with dreams, you may find that you have a much more active dreaming life while Mars is transiting your 12th house. Now, the downside to Mars transiting your 12th house is that it's not the greatest time for your physical health. And so I would suggest being extra careful with your physical health during this time from October 4th onward and into November, but we can talk more about that next month. But the good news with that is, and I would say especially if you're careful to really get your rest and take care of yourself while Mars is transiting your 12th house, once it then eventually moves into your first house, it's just the opposite. And you can look forward to a time of feeling much more physically vital and alive and energized. So just know that from October 4th onward, you want to be extra careful to really get your rest and stuff like that. I would strongly suggest. On October 8th at 1:05 p.m., Venus exits Libra and enters Scorpio, going from your 12th to your first house. So for the first 7.5 days of October, Venus continues transiting your 12th house, which is a time where love and romantic matters happen in secret. We yet again have this 12th house theme of secrecy. They happen behind closed doors, or at least, at the very least, they tend to. It may be a time of endings. It may be a time where you're thinking a lot about relationships in general. And what else was I going to say about that? Well, I guess I can just say that also, this is my personal theory about it, but again, with the 12th house being associated with dreams and Venus being the planet of love and what we like, what we enjoy doing or experiencing, you may have a sort of love of dreams or a love of the imagination, a love of the sort of mystical, spiritual realms the 12th house is so often associated with. Maybe even a love of being alone. In case you can't tell, there's quite the theme for you this month of 12th house to first house activity, and that's just going to continue throughout this video. But so that's the first 7.5 days of the month. And then on October 8th, there's a shift in the energy as Venus enters your first house. And now it's all about sort of you taking on the energy of Venus in a very personal sense, which means you're much more about beautifying your appearance, for one thing. You care about looking beautiful. You're feeling much more friendly, and people are finding you even more likable than usual and enjoying your company and stuff like that. There may be some desire to sort of indulge in like sensual pleasures or material things, because Venus is also very much about money and material possessions and stuff like that. So it's a time when you're feeling very, very Venusian, very attractive, very indulgent in the pleasures of life. So I'm going to fix something on my screen real quick. Don't mind me. There we go. All right. So, and that again is from October 8th onward for October. On October 11th, Mercury enters its retrograde shadow in Scorpio, and that is your first house. So, what is the retrograde shadow? I'll explain this briefly. Imagine my finger is Mercury and it's moving along in the sky like do. And then the whole retrograde cycle is like a pendulum. It goes like this, and then it goes like this, and then it goes like this, and then it continues in the sky. So that first retrograde swing is when it enters its shadow. When it goes backwards, that's the retrograde itself. And then when it goes direct again, that is again its shadow until it then continues on. So what does this mean? It means that when Mercury enters its retrograde shadow on October 11th, it will begin to feel like Mercury is retrograde already, even though it isn't officially yet. So Mercury retrograde, some people think that's the end of the world. Other people think that as long as you're careful, it doesn't really matter. I tend to take a middle of the ground or middle of the road approach and say that while I don't think it's the end of the world, I do think that it should be honored when possible, which means that I think that during a Mercury retrograde, you should avoid beginning new things. You should be careful about what you communicate and how you communicate to other people. You should be aware that miscommunication does take place. You should be careful with electronic and technological devices, being aware that malfunctions are more likely. And you might even want to be careful when traveling, with Mercury's association with travel, knowing that things like mechanical breakdowns and just travel difficulties in general are more likely during a Mercury retrograde. So in my personal experience, honoring the cosmos, honoring the energy of the universe just tends to make things go better. But you do what you want. But that's my advice. And again, that is beginning October 11th. Now, let it also be emphasized here, before I forget, that this is taking place in your first house. So you can think of a planet going retrograde as the signal of that planet being amplified. And so I mentioned earlier how Mercury in your first house is all about you taking on the energy of Mercury in a very personal sense, which has you being much more communicative, being much more intellectual, having a lot more mental activity going on, maybe even having a desire to travel more. So you can expect all of that basically to intensify beginning October 11th. An intensification of that mental activity, that desire to communicate, to say what's really on your mind, that sort of thing. On top of that energy beginning, as I mentioned earlier, on October 3rd. So it's just going to intensify on October 11th from there onward. On October 13th at 5:07 p.m., we have the full moon in Aries. That is in your 6th house. So first of all, recall what I said earlier about the new moon on September 28th being in your 12th house. a time of new beginnings in private matters and in solitude and things of that nature. Well, the full moon is when we see the energy peak, when it culminates, when things come to a head. The full moon is when things happen. So all of that 12th house energy of like reflecting and being alone and figuring things out by yourself and that sort of thing, expect that to come to a head in some way on or around October 13th, most likely on that exact date of October 13th. Now, I should say this just in case: the 12th house is associated with hidden enemies. And so, just for the record, I don't think it's a particularly great risk, but if you're worried about enemies being an issue in your life, October 13th is a day to watch out for. Something might happen in that area that day. But again, it's mostly about the issues that I've already mentioned about aloneness, solitude, that sort of thing. Now, the full moon itself, however, is taking place in your 6th house of your health, your work, your day-to-day activities, your schedule. So expect matters surrounding that area of life to also come to a head on or around October 13th. Now, moving forward, continuing this 12th house to 1st house theme, on October 23rd, the sun enters your sign of Scorpio, as it does every time this time of year, at 1:19 p.m., going again from your 12th house to your 1st house. So the sun is the giver of life. It is a conscious awareness. It is our life force. It is our sense of self. It enlivens and vivifies everything it touches. It brings life to everything it touches. So while it has been transiting your 12th house up till October 23rd, that area of your life has been emphasized even more. It's been given life even more. Perhaps there's been a desire of service also and feeling more empathy with others. Perhaps you have been, again, wanting to like get off by yourself and reflect upon things, and your self-concept during this time is taking a more solitary approach, or you see yourself being alone more. You feel like you identify. That's the really key word right there. You feel like you identify with being alone more during this period of time. Again, that's up until October 23rd, while the sun continues transiting your 12th house. But then on October 23rd at 1:19 p.m., there's a shift in the energy as the sun enters your 1st house. And now you're feeling much more energized personally. You're no longer so interested in being alone. Now you're identifying with being much more assertive and showing the world who you are, essentially. The 1st house of self is all about you personally. And so the sun is lighting that up, and your conscious awareness is much more about yourself and what you're all about personally. You're likely to feel, I would say also, again, more physical energy during this period of time. So it's like no more of this solitude and being alone stuff. Now you're really ready to put the focus on you and be much more assertive and sort of get out into the world, which I almost hesitate to say that because that's almost more of like an 11th house thing. But within certain limits, I would say it's also a 1st house thing, especially with it being the sun. It's like a whole new hero's journey cycle, I would say. Sun in the 1st house. All right, so speaking of which, the new moon in your sign of Scorpio occurs October 27th at 11:38 p.m. in, yet again, your 1st house. And it is opposite Uranus. So let's unpack this. New moon in your 1st house it's a whole new you. So not only do you have the sun in your first house making you, focus on yourself in this very powerful way, but once you then have the new moon in your first house on October 27th, it's a whole new you. You're reinventing yourself, a whole new side of you, or a whole new aspect of you, or multiple new aspects of you are likely to come forth, likely to begin around this time, October 27th. And that, of course, will continue to build throughout the next lunar cycle, through the rest of October and through much of November. So, very exciting time, a whole new you. Now, this new moon, interestingly enough, is opposite Uranus. Sudden, shocking, unexpected, unpredictable Uranus, the planet of genius, of sudden revelations, of sudden new insights, the planet of the bolt of lightning, the weird planet, the unique planet. So all of that energy is going to be infused into this new moon. And this applies to everyone, by the way, this Uranus connection with the new October 27th. So what I am postulating this month is that, and again, interestingly enough, this would apply to everyone, is that with the new moon already being a time of new beginnings, and the planet Uranus being about sudden change, sudden, shocking, unexpected change, I'm expecting this new moon to be almost like a new moon on steroids. It's going to be a new moon that is really about new beginnings. This new moon is going to come in like a bolt of lightning, I would say, and facilitate a whole new cycle that is likely one that is much more free, or at least the new moon itself is going to be very freeing, because it's Uranus' job to sort of break up and break down things that aren't working. And that's even more so right now, I would say, because it's transiting the sign of Taurus, which is an earth sign. And so it's breaking down structures and things that seem very solid, but that are not working. So it's going to be very interesting to see specifically how this plays out. But yes, you can expect that on October 27th. A whole new beginning that is quite possibly also, this is how I think it'll likely manifest for many people, is that something shocking and unexpected will occur, and that's the Uranian energy. And then that shocking and unexpected event itself will then facilitate the new beginning that this new moon is all about. And again, for you personally, Scorpio, not for other signs, but for you personally, this new moon is you're reinventing yourself, a whole new you. That's, again, October 27th, new moon in your first house. On October 30th at 6:04 p.m., we have a Mercury-Venus conjunction in your sign of Scorpio, yet again in your first house. So when Mercury, the planet of the mind, and Venus, the planet of love and harmony, get together, this is like a situation where, oh, let's talk things out. Let's cooperate. Let's discuss things in order to find harmony. Let's be diplomatic. Let's work things out. Let's take something that we previously were not getting along with or about and talk it out, figure it out mentally in order to find harmony. Figure it out mentally, Mercury, in order to find harmony, Venus. So you can expect that sort of energy on October 30th. Now, interestingly enough, soon before filming this very video, we had a Mercury-Venus conjunction as well. I'm filming this on September 16th. And that is, of course, because of the sort of oddities that occur as Mercury slows down, preparing to go retrograde, but that's another issue. That's why we're able to have more than one in such a short span of time. But just recently, for me personally, during the Mercury-Venus conjunction we just had, there was a bit of a breakthrough that day for me involving technology, which would be Mercury and Venus, things that I want, things that I like, things that I enjoy. So, and again, this is kind of going out on a limb here, but I would have the theory, because Mercury is also connected to Uranus in some interesting ways, and we just had the new moon opposite Uranus, or we will have at the end of the month in October, right before this Mercury-Venus conjunction occurs, and Uranus is about breakthroughs. I would say that for some people, the Mercury-Venus conjunction on October 30th could be a breakthrough of a very pleasant, delightful kind. So you can look forward to that. Now, I'm not sure, but the Mercury retrograde might cause some complications with that. But generally speaking, especially with Venus in the mix, I would expect it to be a very pleasant experience, however it manifests for people. So for most people, it should be a pleasant experience. Now, that's in your first house. And so for you personally, Scorpio, it's going to be either a breakthrough or a working things out that is very personal to you, that involves your sense of self or you personally. It's perhaps even something that is all about you and maybe even happening in a somewhat internal sense or affecting your sense of self or your identity. So should be interesting is, I guess, all the rest that I can, or all the more I can say about that at this point. All right, the final piece of information I have for you is that on October 31st, Halloween, wow, that was an interesting change in the camera. Okay. On Halloween at 11:41 a.m., Mercury does station retrograde in Scorpio in your first house. So this isn't really too much new information. I already talked about Mercury retrograde earlier when I talked about it entering its shadow on October 11th. This is when it officially goes retrograde, is on Halloween of all days. So if you're not feeling the Mercury retrograde by October 31st, you'll likely start to feel it then, because this is when it reaches the end of that first pendulum swing, and then it does start to go retrograde. And again, that's in your first house, so expect that mental activity surrounding you personally and your willingness to speak up and be bold to just intensify even further at this time. So take everything I said earlier about the Mercury retrograde and turn it up a notch starting Halloween day. So should be an interesting Halloween, having Mercury go retrograde that same day. So that's it, Scorpio. That's all I've got for you for October. I hope you have a magnificent month and happy Halloween. And I hope you enjoyed this video. If you did, feel free to subscribe if you're not already, because I do indeed plan on returning very soon with more astrology and tarot related content, astrology and tarot forecasts. So I do hope that you'll consider checking out more of what I have to offer in the future. So once again, thank you so much. Have a great month, and bye for now.